Materia Toure.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I'm pleased also to speak on this inquiry and want to acknowledge Chester Burrows for bringing the inquiry to the Social Services Select Committee in the last term of Parliament. Sir, data shows that children growing up in violent families are more likely to engage in youth offending. Now, the inquiry reiterates this fact, this connection, but then doesn't deal effectively with this part, addressing these issues of family violence and how we can connect the dots on these issues for our kids, our most at-risk kids. The social and economic risk factors for youth offending correspond very closely to those risk factors for domestic violence and child abuse. So joining the dots between these things is critical. Given the findings, an effective strategy to combat child abuse, domestic violence and youth violence would be a collaborative, community-based prevention, early intervention effort that aims to reduce the social and economic risk factors for families. There is a very strong argument for the development of national and local collaborative prevention efforts between these three areas, and that approach is missing from the inquiry and its report. Child abuse and domestic violence often occur in the same family, and they are linked in important ways to the serious consequences for the safety of all family members. First, where one form of family violence exists, there is a very strong likelihood that another also does. Second, research shows that the impact of children witnessing parental domestic violence is strikingly similar to the consequences of being directly abused by a parent. And both experiences are significant contributors to youth violence. There's been some new research in New Zealand by psychologist Julia Aone following 600 Māori, European and Pacific Island violence youth offenders. That research shows a very strong connection between exposure to family violence and the likelihood that those young people will become offenders themselves. More than half of all violent youth offenders involved in the study, regardless of their ethnicity, were exposed to family violence at some point in their lives. There is compelling evidence that exposure to inter-partner violence is associated with a host of negative mental health and social consequences in children and adolescents, and that these children display more negative effects and negative cognitions, as well as more social and academic problems compared to those who do not. I agree that the thresholds for activating care need to be lowered, as has been set out by previous speakers. What I'm concerned about throughout these findings and recommendations is that there is not mention of how this support is going to link youth offending, child abuse and domestic abuse services together. When we look for opportunities for that early identification, we could simply start with the 150,000 notifications to child, youth and family that happen every year. They are often described by the Minister as false positives, those who don't meet the threshold. They're not false positives. They're indications of concern and problems that need to be addressed. The problem is they don't meet the threshold for active intervention. They go into a waiting room and there they stay, waiting for someone to help them. There has been a cry for help and there is no response. We don't have a system that connects all of those things together and provides support to those families at an early stage when they need it the most. Where is the protective place? Where is the place that a protective parent can go when they need help? Where are the services that will provide direct intervention for those families? This was identified in the Netherlands report that the Every Child Counts put out last week, that in the Netherlands there are places, community hubs, places where families can go at that early stage of need to get their issues addressed before their kids become young offenders in the future. Thank you, Mr Speaker. We need to stop working from a model where we need to identify those children and work to a model where we have a place for those families and those kids to come for help. And that does not exist in the services we provide for the moment. The family courts have recently announced changes where they are in a rush to save costs. They are increasing the risk of those who've been exposed to domestic violence to continue to be exposed to that violence by having a family resolution process together without addressing the issues of family violence, domestic violence. Often those who are subject to that violence are then exposed to further risk. Are we really so blind that we cannot connect the dots between all of these parts of the family violence issue? So this inquiry has been effective in some respects for raising these issues and addressing and providing some recommendations that are very good. But without without a concerted effort to join the dots between the youth offending, domestic violence, family violence, we simply will not provide support to those families and those kids who need us the most before they get into trouble. And surely that is where we should put our resources. Kia ora.
Senator Lawley Taylor.